Ladies and gentlemen, I am the AmericanSpyFox, and today I'd like to continue reading Michael Azarad's book, The Story of Nirvana, Come As You Are. We're on Chapter 2. We read Chapter 0, Chapter 1. Now we're on Chapter 2. Let us continue. As usual, if I find anything within the chapter that I want to further elaborate on or comment on or whatever, I will interject. And I look forward to your comments. I think the best way to understand a book is to read it chapter by chapter and then discuss that chapter you just read. You are more likely to remember details, and I look forward to hearing your comments about Chapter 2. Around this time, Kurt first noticed Chris Novoselic at Aberdeen High School. I remember thinking he was definitely somebody I wanted to meet, says Kurt, but we never connected. The two didn't have any classes together. Kurt occasionally saw Chris at pep assemblies where he would sometimes participate in little skits, only to sabotage them by doing things like spontaneously singing the Star-Spangled Banner. He was a hilarious person who obviously had a different sense of humor, says Kurt. Everyone was just laughing at him, but I was laughing with him, because he was basically making fools out of everybody else. He was just a really clever, funny, loudmouth person. He was taller than anybody in school. He was huge. It was too bad I never got to hang out with him because I really needed a friend during high school. Kurt felt like an outcast, but even outcasts can find other outcasts to hang out with, except apparently in Aberdeen. I wanted to fit in somewhere, but not with the average kid, not with the popular kids at school, says Kurt. I wanted to fit in with the geeks, but the geeks were sub-geeks in Aberdeen. They weren't the average geek. They weren't the type of kid who would listen to Devo. They were just usually deformed. Kurt says there were only two other guys in school that he even thought about being friends with. Both were at least cool enough to be into Oingo Boingo, the manic new wave band from Los Angeles. But they were just such geeks, total idiots, Kurt says. They were the kind of guys who would paint their faces at football games. High school was a teenage wasteland for Kurt, composed of three casts: the social types, the math nerds, and the stoners. The girls at Aberdeen High School had noticed Kurt's dimples and blue eyes and decided that he was cute. They kind of liked me, says Kurt, but I just didn't like any of those girls because they were just so stupid. And because girls liked Kurt, their jock boyfriends tried to buddy up to him, but Kurt blew them off too. This goes back to an interview in Denmark. MTV Europe did this interview with Nirvana at some festival in Denmark or Finland, one of those countries. And Kurt said, we weren't rejects, we were the chosen rejects. He says, girls actually liked me. Their jock boyfriends wanted to hang out with me, but I turned them down. I didn't want to be popular. I wanted to be different. Kurt considered hanging out with the nerdy kids who were into computers and chess, but they didn't like music. That left the stoners. Although I hated them, he says, they were at least into rock and roll, so Kurt donned the typical stoner jacket, the jean jacket with the fleece lining which still finds favor among today's wasted youth, and began hanging out at the traditional stoner hangout, the smoker's shed. Kurt hardly said a word to anybody. He was so quiet that occasionally someone would ask him if he was a narc. Kurt had fallen out of touch with the Melvins after his move back to Aberdeen, but then he met a fellow music fan named Dale Crover at the Smoker's Shed. The Smoker's Shed is just the nickname where all the local potheads hang out. Chris also knew Crover because Crover used to jam with Chris's younger brother, Robert. When the Melvins needed a drummer, Chris suggested Crover, who got the gig. And since Kurt knew Crover, he began hanging out with the Melvins again. The Melvins began practicing in an extra room at Crover's parents' house. Anywhere the Melvins rehearsed quickly turned into a seemingly permanent haven for a group of Aberdeen stoners dubbed the Klingons. And Crover's place was no different. Clad in bell-bottom jeans and quilted pullover jackets with zippered pockets so they could keep their pot safe, these guys were just the most classic cartoon types of stoner metalhead kids that you could imagine, Kurt recalls. For the Klingons, hanging out at the Melvins' practice space was just about the only source of excitement there was. All there was to do in Aberdeen was drink beer, smoke pot, and worship Satan, quips Crover. There's nothing there. We watched a lot of TV. The practice space itself was festooned with posters of Kiss, Motley Crue, and Ted Nugent, pages torn out of Circus magazine, and pictures of naked women with different faces pasted on them. A similar image would one day resurface on a Nirvana t-shirt. Man, oh man, was I wrong. I was dead wrong. I made one of the very first Nirvana videos I ever made was about t-shirts, Nirvana t-shirts from the 90s. Not the designs you see today, but original Nirvana designs. And I came across this one t-shirt that had, it wasn't like a real picture, but like a drawing of a naked woman. And what I said, because I had never seen that shirt before, and I do not remember it from the 90s, I said, I don't think this is a real original shirt. I don't think Kurt Cobain would have allowed a naked woman to be put on his shirt. But the whole feminist movement thing kind of came later when Nirvana got famous, right? And then they were influential enough to bring other bands like the Breeders, L7, Bikini Kill along with them and make them famous as well. So once Kurt became famous, he used his fame to not only make other bands famous, but a lot of times he would try to make female musicians famous, including Courtney Love. People like Kathleen Hanna and Mary Lou Lord and Jennifer Finch, those were all women that Kurt helped. So in my mind, I was thinking, nah, Kurt wouldn't have put a naked woman on a t-shirt. But this was pre-Nevermind. This was way before anybody knew who Nirvana was when this became a Nirvana t-shirt, and it was a very limited edition t-shirt. So if you have it, hold on to it. It's worth a lot of money. Visitors would go up the stairs of the back porch of the house through a tiny room and then into the rehearsal room. Buzz didn't like many people around at practice, so the Klingons contented themselves with hanging out on the back porch while the Melvins rehearsed. The band's daily practice usually lasted 3 or more hours, but only because they had to stop playing every 20 minutes or so while one of the members transacted some business with the Klingons. Kurt auditioned to become a Melvin, but it didn't work out. I totally botched it, Kurt says. I was so nervous that I forgot all the songs. I literally couldn't play a note. I just stood there with my guitar and played feedback with a blushed face. It was just as well, because Kurt was already writing and recording his own material. Matt Lukin recalls a tape Kurt made of his own songs, just guitar and vocals. There were just some really cool songs, recalls Lukin, especially for somebody in Aberdeen who played guitar at that point that was our age. Most guys just wanted to play Judas Priest. We found it kind of odd that some kid was writing his own songs and would rather play that than Motley Crue. And then Buzz Osborne introduced Kurt Cobain to punk rock. Osborne made a few compilation tapes, mostly Southern California bands such as Black Flag, Flipper, and MDC. MDC is Millions of Dead Cops. When Kurt Cobain would be arrested for graffiti, he would have that copy that Buzz Osborne made for him of MDC in his pocket. Imagine being arrested by a police officer. They search your pockets and they pull out a cassette tape that says Millions of Dead Cops. That would be a very uncomfortable situation. The first song on the first tape was Black Flag's Damaged 2. An all-out attack of a brace of guitars and shambling but assaultive drums brimming with buzzsaw rancor. Damaged by you, damaged by me. I'm confused, don't want to be confused, screams singer Henry Rollins. Kurt was floored. It was like listening to something from a different planet, he says. It took me a few days to accept it. By the end of the week, though, he was a certified, self-proclaimed punk rocker. I sensed, says Kurt, that it was speaking more clearly and more realistically than the average rock and roll lyric. Soon after that, in August of 1984, Kurt, Lukin, Osborne, and others drove up to Seattle to see Black Flag play the Mountaineer Club during the Slip It In tour. In order to raise enough money for a ticket, Kurt sold his entire record collection, which at the time consisted of albums by bands such as Journey, Foreigner, and Pat Benatar. He sold them for $12. It was really great, says Kurt of the show. I was instantly converted. Henry Rollins converts Kurt Cobain into a certified punk rocker. Becoming a punk rocker fed into my low self-esteem because it helped me realize that I don't need to become a rock star. I don't want to become a rock star, Kurt says. So I was fighting this thin line. I was always on the left or right side of not caring and not wanting to and not being able to, yet kind of wanting to at the same time. Still wanting to prove myself to people. It's kind of confusing. I'm so glad that I got into punk rock at the time I did because it gave me these few years that I needed to grow up and put my values in perspective and realize what kind of person I am. I'm just really glad I was able to find punk rock, Kurt says. It was really a godsend. Osborne also showed him a way to deal with his environment. He just had a really awesome attitude toward the average redneck, says Kurt. I was really inspired by his attitude. It was, fuck with them as much as you can get away with. We would go to jock parties and follow the big muscle men around and spit on their backs and write dirty sayings on the walls of their houses and take the eggs out of the refrigerator and put them in the host's bed. Just try to get away with as much damage as we could. Eventually, Kurt met a guy named Jesse Reed, who was the only nice friend that I could find in Aberdeen, besides a handsome kid named Meyer Lofton. Kurt met Lofton in art class, and the two hit it off after discovering they were into the same music. Everything from stuff like AC/DC, Aerosmith, and Led Zeppelin to punk rock. To Lofton, Kurt looked like your average blue jeans and nice, neat haircut kind of straight-laced kid. It really surprised him that Kurt was a musician. He was kind of mild-mannered and quiet, says Lofton. Very nice, very sincere. They became good friends. I've read that Wendy, although poor, would still try to buy her kids the best clothes she could and send them to school just as neat and nice as she could possibly make them. So this was something that rubbed off on Kurt until he was old enough to sort of do his own thing. His mom was still pushing him to look like a very conservative, well-groomed child. What Kurt didn't know at first was that Lofton was gay. Lofton mentioned it to Kurt soon after they started hanging out. He said, "Well, that's okay. You're still my friend. I still love you. It's no problem," says Lofton. And we hugged. Lofton would sometimes stay over at Kurt's house, and Wendy, a cool mom, let them party in the house as long as they didn't drive anywhere until the next morning. That's interesting. I would have never thought that about Wendy. Once, Wendy came home drunk and caught them smoking pot. In a futile attempt to psych Kurt out of smoking pot, she ate his stash and got terribly stoned and sick afterward. On less eventful nights, they'd hang out in Kurt's room, and Kurt would teach Lofton Led Zeppelin licks on the guitar. So apparently Wendy was cool with them drinking but not smoking pot. But hanging out with an openly gay friend was a little more risky than Kurt had anticipated. Soon, says Kurt, I started to realize that people were looking at me even more peculiarly than usual. He started to get harassed. It always seemed to happen in PE class. After everybody got dressed, somebody would inevitably call Kurt a f***it and push him up against a locker. They felt threatened because they were naked and I was supposedly gay, says Kurt. So they either better cover up their penises or punch me, or both. Life in high school just got harder for Kurt. Often, jocks would chase him on the way home from school. Sometimes they caught him. Every day after school, says Kurt, this one kid would hold me down in the snow and sit on my head. After that, says Kurt, I started being proud of the fact that I was gay even though I wasn't. I really enjoyed the conflict. It was pretty exciting because I almost found my identity. I was a special geek. I wasn't quite the punk rocker I was looking for, but at least it was better than being the average geek. But the social pressures eventually became too strong, and one day Kurt walked up to Lofton, visibly upset, and told him that he could not hang around with him anymore. He was just getting too much abuse for being the friend of a faggot. Lofton understood completely, and they parted ways. That's sad, man. They were friends, they got along, they liked the same music, they both played guitar. But because Kurt was getting so much harassment and actually being beat up for being the friend of a gay kid, he decided, I can't be your friend anymore. I'm getting abused too much just for being your friend. Kurt had started smoking pot in 9th grade and got high every day until senior year, when he at least waited until nightfall. I was getting so paranoid from it that I couldn't be as neurotic as I already naturally was and have it intensified by pot, Kurt says. He did badly in school and began skipping classes in 11th grade. Moving around so much between schools was only part of the problem. The biggest reason I flunked out of certain classes was because I hated the teachers so much, says Kurt. There was this one guy who was a religious fanatic, an apocalyptic racist. He taught social sciences, and he would do nothing but waste our time by incorporating revelations into history. He was part of the mid-'80s Cold War scare. The Russians are coming. One of the crusaders for that Reagan mentality. Son of a bitch. I wanted to kill him every day. I used to fantasize how I'd kill him in front of the class, because the rest of the class were completely buying it, hook, line, and sinker, totally swallowing this garbage. I couldn't believe so many people were just taking it. Kurt was rebelling at home, too. He didn't want to be part of the family, but he wanted to live in the family house, says Wendy. He complained about everything I asked him to do, which was very minimal. Meanwhile, Wendy acknowledges that her patience with Kurt wore thin because she was also angry at Pat for his drinking. Pat is her boyfriend, and Pat's an alcoholic. He doesn't work. He's a womanizer. He cheats on Wendy, and instead of Wendy dumping Pat or taking her frustrations out on the person who is causing her the stress, she actually starts taking it out on Kurt. She often transferred some of her anger to her kids. For a few months, Kurt went out with a stoner girl, a very pretty young woman named Jackie. According to Kurt, she was basically using me until her boyfriend got out of jail. What the fuck? One night, Kurt sneaked Jackie up to his room. Kurt was psyched. He was about to lose his virginity. They had just gotten their clothes off when Wendy suddenly burst into the room, flicked on the lights, and hissed, "Get that slut out of here!" Kurt ran away to a friend's house and stayed until his friend's mother called up and said, "Wendy, I think your son is living at my house." Kurt stopped smoking pot in an attempt to try to turn my life around. Then Kurt's stepmother called up and asked Kurt to live there again. Right away, Dawn said that if Kurt were to stay there, he'd have to stop doing music and start doing something constructive with his life. He somehow persuaded Kurt to pawn his guitar, then got him to take the Navy entrance exam. Kurt got a very high score, and an excited local recruiter came by the house 2 nights in a row. But on the second night, right on the brink of signing up, Kurt went downstairs to his basement room, found some pot, smoked it, came back upstairs and said, "No thanks," then packed up his stuff and left. He'd been there only a week. He wouldn't see his father again for another 8 years. To this day, Don collects all the magazine articles on Kurt that he can find. He's got a big scrapbook and a cupboard full of memorabilia. Everything I know about Kurt, says Don Cobain, I've read in newspapers and magazines. I got to know him that way. Wow, he was your f***ing son. You were supposed to be there for him as he was growing up. That reveals a lot to me. For a father to say, I got to know my son through newspapers and articles as he was an adult, that tells me Don wasn't even trying when Kurt was a kid. Wendy sent Kurt off to live with his buddy Jesse Reed, whose parents were born-again Christians. Kurt was broke and told a local drug dealer that he would sell him his guitar and left it at his house on good faith. After a week, Kurt changed his mind. But the dealer kept the guitar anyway, and Kurt went without it for months until he and Reed snatched it back. Kurt wasn't quite the ideal house guest at the Reeds. I was a bad influence on Jesse, Kurt says. I smoked pot and I didn't like to go to school. Once, Kurt spent a long phone conversation insulting Mrs. Reed, then hung up the phone only to realize she had been listening in on an extension. The final straw came one day when Kurt, locked out of the house, did the only logical thing and kicked in the door. Kurt says that Reed's father hit the roof and told him, "Kurt, we've tried really hard to turn you into a good citizen, but it's just not going to work. You are a lost cause. So I'd appreciate it if you packed up your stuff and left." Mrs. Reed explained to Wendy that Kurt was leading Jesse down the wrong road. A special remedial program for school didn't work out. 6 months before graduation, Kurt realized he had almost 2 years of credits to make up. Mr. Hunter, his art teacher, had entered him in some college scholarship competitions, and Kurt had won 2. But he still decided to drop out in May of 1985, just a few weeks short of what should have been his graduation. Kurt had decided to make music his life's work, but Wendy felt he was wasting his time. I told him he better get his life going, says Wendy. If you're not going to finish school, you better get a job and get your life going, because you're not going to stay here mooching off of us. But Kurt did continue to mooch off his mom, and one day she laid down the law. I told him, if this doesn't get better, if you don't get a job, you're going to be out, says Wendy. You're going to come home one day and you're going to find your stuff in a box. Sure enough, Kurt came home from hanging out at the Melvin's practice space one day to find all of his belongings packed in cardboard boxes stacked on the dining room floor. I played the tough love thing, says Wendy. That was when tough love was first coming into being, and I thought, well, I'm going to try this on him. Isn't it weird that after Kurt's death, Courtney blamed his suicide on the intervention, saying that she was playing the tough love card? Courtney loved reading articles and books about herself and Kurt. Guaranteed she read this book. Don't you think it's weird that she signed Wendy's name on the missing persons report and then used Wendy's line, oh, I was playing tough love on Kurt. I really loved him, but he was doing the wrong things. Courtney the Chameleon. Using some of Don's child support money as a deposit, Kurt moved into an apartment in Aberdeen with Jesse Reed, paying his rent with money he earned working at a restaurant at one of the resorts of the Washington coast. He tried to enlist Reed to play with him. They would talk about guitars all the time when they first met, and Reed's dad used to play in a surf band that had actually put out some singles. When Reed mentioned that he had just got a bass guitar, Kurt got very excited. We started playing together one night, and it turns out he was one of the most musically retarded people I've ever met, says Kurt, the disappointment still plain in his voice. He couldn't even play Louie Louie. Louie Louie is a notoriously easy song to play. Soon, Kurt got a job as a janitor back at Aberdeen High, spending most of his days scraping gum off the bottoms of desks. It was the last place on earth he wanted to be. One day, he smuggled home a sample case of shaving cream and decorated a doll with it so it looked like something out of The Exorcist, with the green, slimy goo hanging out of its mouth. He hung the doll by its neck in the window that overlooked the sidewalk just to freak out the rednecks. I had the apartment decorated in typical punk rock fashion, with baby dolls hanging by their necks with blood all over them, says Kurt. There was beer and puke and blood all over the carpet. Garbage stacked up for months. I never did the dishes. Jesse and I cooked food for about a week and then put all our greasy hamburger dishes in the sink and filled it up full of water, and it sat there for the entire 5 months I was there. People would party at Kurt's place all the time, and the bash would invariably peak with an all-out shaving cream war. While hanging out at the Melvin's practice space, Chris Novoselic and Kurt had struck up a friendship. Chris mentioned that he played guitar and they would hang out and listen to music, drink, and make little movies with Chris's Super 8 camera. Sometimes Chris's girlfriend Shelly would come over to the apartment and party too. They were outcasts and weirdos, but at least they were outcasts and weirdos together. We all had so much in common, Shelley recalls. It was like us against everybody else. It was great to have our own circle, and we were really close-knit and nothing bugged us. If one person would do something, we wouldn't hold grudges, and we were less jaded and more accepting of other things. It was really fun. After 3 months, Jesse Reed moved out to join the Navy. One day, Kurt was acid tripping with a friend who had come over to Kurt's place on a scooter. When the friend went downstairs to get something from his scooter, Kurt's redneck neighbor began beating up his friend because he had parked the scooter on his property. Kurt heard the commotion and dashed downstairs as his friend ran away. The neighbors settled for Kurt instead, eventually pushing Kurt into his apartment and punching and manhandling him for 2 hours like a cat playing with a mouse. Eventually, he stopped punching Kurt and sat down to rest. This sounds like kidnapping to me. Then he looked around the room and noticed the mutilated Barbie dolls and the paintings of the three-headed babies and the graffiti in the garbage, and a flicker of fear and confusion crossed his face. He started asking me questions, says Kurt. Why do I do all that stuff to my room? He started to shove Kurt around again, and Kurt screamed until the landlady hollered upstairs that she was going to call the police. The bully ran away. Eventually the police came, but they advised Kurt not to antagonize his neighbor by pressing charges. Kurt got his revenge. For a month afterward, his friends would come over and pound on the neighbor's walls and scream obscenities and death threats while the bully cowered in his apartment. Kurt says he left little presents on his doorstep, like a 6-pack of beer with acid in it, or a painting of a redneck hanging from a tree. Kurt stayed on for a couple of months after Reed left. At first, he could sweet-talk the landlady into letting him pay his rent late, but she began to notice the condition of the apartment. Kurt's friends would write all over the walls and the stairway. The apartment itself was in shambles. I wonder if this is where Kathleen Hanna wrote Kurt Smells Like Teen Spirit, or if that came later. Kurt couldn't keep up with the rent and eventually moved out in the late fall of 1985, owing several months' rent. Unemployed and virtually penniless, he passed the time that winter by hanging out in the library, reading books and writing poetry. So this is where he would meet the librarian who is interviewed that I've showed on the channel before. At the end of the day, he'd buy a six-pack of beer and bring it over to a friend's house, where they would drink, and eventually Kurt would crash on the couch. Other times, he'd sleep in a cardboard box on Dale Crover's porch, Chris and Shelley's van, or sneak back into his mother's house while she was at work and crawl up into the attic or sleep on the deck of the house overnight. And sometimes he'd sleep under the North Aberdeen Bridge, which crosses the Wishkah River near Wendy's house. Why wouldn't Chris just let Kurt stay in him and Shelley's apartment? Chris and Shelley had an apartment together. Well, I guess at this point in time, they're not even in a band yet. So maybe they weren't that close. Or maybe Shelley was a big B and didn't want Kurt there. As a single male, Kurt qualified for $40 worth of food stamps a month, but he rarely bought food with them. Instead, he and his friends would fan out around town and buy Jolly Rancher penny candies with the food stamps and use the change to buy a case of beer. The operation was an entire day's work. There was a time when you actually got paper food stamps, and if you paid with paper food stamps, they would give you real cash back. He was rather proud of himself for being able to survive without having to have a job or a home. His only worries were being able to steal food, catch fish from the river, and get food stamps, and bum the occasional macaroni and cheese from his friends. I was just living out the Aberdeen fantasy version of being a punk rocker, says Kurt. It was really easy. It was nothing compared to what most kids are subjected to after they run away to the big city. There was no threat of danger, ever. Kurt would have moved to Seattle, but he was too intimidated by the big city to do it alone. He'd barely been out of the Aberdeen-Montesano area, and nobody else in Aberdeen was brave enough to make the move. Sometimes he'd stop by Wendy's house and she'd make him lunch. For my guilt over letting Kurt go and live with his dad, says Wendy, I have always pampered Kurt. He would come to visit. You want some lunch? Fix, fix, fix. Because I was guilty, I was feeling horribly guilty. Wendy became pregnant and was feeling depressed about what had become of Kurt. I've really screwed up my first kid, so what am I going to do having another one? She remembers thinking to herself. And he came home at one point when I was very pregnant and I was crying about it, she says. He asked me what was the matter, and I told him I felt so awful having one in the oven and one out in the streets, and he just knelt down and put his arms around me and said he was doing fine and not to worry about him, and that he was going to do just fine. That winter, Kurt got together with Dale Crover on bass and Craig Hawkinson on drums and began rehearsing some of his material. Once, the trio, which Kurt dubbed Fecal Matter, opened for the Melvins at the Spot Tavern, a beach bar in Moclips, a remote little town on the Washington coast. After a while, they ditched Hawkinson, whom they didn't like much anyway. The two began rehearsing intensively in preparation for recording a demo tape. With Matt Lukin behind the wheel of the trusty blue Impala, they set out for the Seattle home of Kurt's Aunt Mary, the musician who had a 4-track tape recorder. Mary was taken aback by the aggressiveness of Kurt's vocals. She didn't have any idea that I was such an angry person, says Kurt. He recorded the guitars directly into the tape machine, a classic low-budget punk rock technique that he used again years later on Nevermind's Territorial Pissings. Territorial Pissings was played directly into a 4-track. That's awesome. That's why it sounds so raunchy. They recorded 7 tracks with titles like Sound of Dentage, Bambi Slaughter, and Laminated Effect, which sounds like a cross between Nevermind's Stay Away and the MTV theme, as well as a slowed down instrumental version of Downer, which would later appear on the Bleach album. The Fecal Matter tape contained some of the ingredients that would distinguish Kurt's later music. Mainly the ultra-heavy riffing sparked by an ear for the hook, but it also had thrash-worthy tempos and a gnarled sense of song structure as reminiscent of the Melvins as it is of Metallica. There were not yet any strong melodies to speak of, and Kurt's vocals range from a gruff bark to a blood-curdling howl. Later, Kurt rehearsed the Fecal Matter songs for a while with Buzz Osborne on bass and former Melvins drummer Mike Dillard. But then Dillard lost interest and the project evaporated completely when, as Osborne remembers it, Kurt got disgusted with it because I wouldn't buy a bass system, and so he said that I wasn't dedicated enough. Kurt had met a hardcore partier named Steve Sillinger at Aberdeen High, where his father Lamont was, and still is, an English teacher. Schillinger had first noticed Kurt because he had written Motorhead on his Peachy folder. Schillinger remembers tapes Kurt would make of his music. Really cheesy heavy metal songs, as he recalls, with titles like Suicide Samurai. The first time Schillinger and Kurt made plans to hang out together at a metal church concert, Schillinger ditched him because there wasn't enough booze to go around and I didn't know him that well. Schillinger's friends had worn out their welcome with his parents, so when Kurt needed a place to stay, he befriended Schillinger's brother Eric. The Schillingers had 5 sons and 1 daughter, so another mouth to feed wasn't a big deal. Kurt wound up staying there for about 8 months, beginning late that winter of 1985, and faithfully did his chores just like everyone else. Eric also played guitar, and Steve Schillinger swears that Eric and Kurt would plug their guitars into the family stereo and play a particularly tasty section of Iron Maiden's Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Both Eric and Kurt totally deny this, but as Schillinger says, people often deny their past. The Schillingers had taken in several quote-unquote strays over the years, and usually a day or two later a concerned parent would call the house and ask whether the kid was there. Not this time. We didn't hear word one from Kurt's mom the whole time he was there, says Lamont Schillinger. That summer, Kurt intensified his long career as a graffitiist. He'd been a vandal ever since he started getting drunk in 7th grade, but this summer's work was, as Kurt says, the focused statement. He'd play the Bad Brains Rock for Light album over and over by day, then drink and eat acid by night throughout the summer. He, Osborne, Steve Schillinger, and others started with marker pens, prowling the alleys behind the main streets of Aberdeen, writing provocative things like "Abort Christ" and "God is gay," or spray painting "queer" on 4x4 pickups, preferably with rifle racks in them, to annoy the rednecks. Other times they wrote deliberate nonsense like "amputate acrobats" or "boat AKK," just to baffle people. One night they noticed a huge ornate Pink Floyd mural which someone had painstakingly painted in one of the alleys. Its minutes were numbered. We were freshly punked, Schillinger explains, and we had spray paint. Kurt had silver spray paint and Schillinger had black, and right over the pink, Schillinger wrote black. Over the Floyd, Kurt wrote flag. We had hippies who just wanted to kick our freaking asses the whole rest of the summer, says Schillinger, still gleeful about it. We were like hunted underground figures. Kurt was out on a graffiti raid with Buzz Osborne and Chris Novoselic, who had just spray painted the words "Homosex Rules" on the side of a bank wall when a police car appeared out of nowhere and caught Kurt in its headlights. Chris and Osborne ran away and hid in a garbage dumpster, but Kurt was hauled into the police station and took the rap. A police report detailed the contents of his pockets: 1 guitar pick, 1 key, 1 can of beer, 1 mood ring, and 1 cassette by the militant punk band Millions of Dead Cops. He got a $180 fine and a 30-day suspended jail sentence. Vandalism wasn't anything new to Kurt. While he was still in high school, he and his friends would find an abandoned house or one that was in the midst of being vacated, break in, and destroy everything in sight. Kurt had always wanted to rent one particular house that stood in a field because it was a perfect band rehearsal pad, but the owners repeatedly refused to let him rent the place, always renting it to someone else. Late one night, Kurt was walking home from a party with a friend and they noticed the house was vacant again. They broke in and went berserk, throwing the appliances around the house, taking care to break every single window and smashing everything else to bits with a weight set. I got my revenge, says Kurt. Eventually, he took a job as a maintenance man at the YMCA about a block away from the Schillingers' house, mostly so he could afford some musical equipment should he suddenly find a band. In the morning, he'd walk over to work, check in with his boss, then go back over to the house and sit around and watch TV and drink until quitting time. Sometimes he'd have to clean off the graffiti that he himself had written the night before. A little later, Kurt got the only regular job he's ever really loved, as a swimming instructor for kids aged 3 through 7. Kurt's first live performance was with Dale Crover on bass drum, snare, and cymbal, Buzz Osborne on bass, and Kurt essentially rapping his poetry over improvised heavy rock at Gesco Hall, a barn-like performance space in Olympia associated with Evergreen State College. The trio was originally called Brown Tao, but a misspelling on the poster made it Brown Cow. Kurt was extremely nervous. I had to get drunk, he says. I got totally wasted on wine. Attendance was sparse and the reaction was lackluster, but two people in the audience, Olympia scenester Slim Moon and his buddy Dylan Carlson, a self-made intellectual who played guitar in several bands around town, were blown away. The two knew Kurt as a member of the Melvins' entourage, but now he was something more. That's when our perception of Kurt changed from the dweeby trenchcoat new waver that hung out with the Melvins, says Slim Moon, to realizing, wait, this guy has talent. Carlson, now one half of the ultra-heavy guitar noise duo Earth, walked up to Kurt afterward and told him the show was one of the best things he'd ever seen. They began bumping into each other at cool shows in Olympia and soon became fast friends, as they are to this day. Meanwhile, Kurt had begun to hang out with a drug dealer named Grunt. Not his real name. He was this total drug fiend stoner, says Kurt. He was like the overlord king of drugs. Grunt was a despicable person, but people hung out with him because he could get practically any drug. No one knew it at the time, but he got his wares by burglarizing pharmacies along with his lover, sidekick, and whipping boy. Grunt began bringing Kurt handfuls of Percodans, an opiate-derived painkiller, each in their little foil and plastic pouches, charging him only $1 a day. Kurt liked Percodans because they made him feel relaxed. It just felt like the best euphoric state that I'd ever been in, he says. It was just like sleeping. It was as close to sleep as I could get without actually having to sleep. Kurt was so naive about drugs that he didn't know Percodan was addictive and got hooked without even realizing it. He eventually took up to 10 Percodans a day and was getting real itchy. After about 2 months, Grunt's supply ran out and Kurt had to go cold turkey. It wasn't that bad, he says. I had diarrhea and I sweated in Eric's bed for a couple of days. One night that summer, Grunt and Kurt did heroin together. Grunt shot Kurt up. It was really scary, says Kurt. I always wanted to do it. I always knew that I would. He's not exactly sure why he was so sure he'd eventually do it. I don't know, says Kurt. I just knew. Besides, by then he'd done just about every other drug except PCP. I'd always heard about people freaking out and jumping off of buildings after they did PCP. Heroin was the final frontier. Another attraction was the decadent outlaw glamour the drug had acquired through its association with rockers such as Keith Richards and Iggy Pop. Iggy Pop, he was my total idol, says Kurt. I just wanted to try it because I knew that I liked opiates. It was such a scarce thing to find heroin in Aberdeen that I just thought I would try it. Kurt knew there was no chance of getting hooked on the drug because it was impossible to get a steady supply in Aberdeen. Heroin's illusion of euphoria may also have had something to do with it. Euphoria of any kind was in short supply in Kurt's life. Beginning in high school, he had become so angry at his surroundings that he developed nervous tics like popping his knuckles, scratching his face, and flipping his hair compulsively. His eye twitched. He thought he might be becoming schizophrenic. It was a mixture of hating people so much because they didn't live up to my expectations and just being so fed up with being around the same kind of idiot all the time, he says. It was obvious in my face and how I reacted toward people that I couldn't stand them. I had this personal vendetta toward them because they were so macho and manly and stupid. I started to become aware of this, that people were noticing that I had this hatred toward a lot of people. Kurt was convinced that everyone knew he felt this way, which only made him feel more neurotic. He grew more and more paranoid because he was sure everyone knew he could freak out at any time. They thought I was the kid who was most likely to succeed, to bring an AK-47 to the school and blow everybody away, Kurt says. I just had this air about me that I would eventually explode one day. People eventually just stayed away from me. Opiates like Percodan gave Kurt a sense of relief. On opiates, he didn't hate people as much. I had a little bit of affection for them, or at least could see past the superficiality of their personality and think of them as a real person, he says. Maybe they had had a fucked up childhood, or maybe it's their environment that's making them this way. It's relieved some of the animosity that I had toward people. I needed to do that because I was tired of hating people so much and being so judgmental toward everyone. It just allowed me to have a few days of peace of mind. Meanwhile, although Kurt and Eric had started off as friends, their friendship had begun to disintegrate, perhaps because of a musical rivalry. The antagonism built and built until one night, 8 months after Kurt arrived at the Schillingers, when Kurt, Eric, and Steve Schillinger came home from 3 different parties, all quite drunk. Steve says it was over a frozen pizza pie, while Kurt thinks it was because he wanted to sleep and Eric wanted to watch TV, but for some reason a fight broke out between Kurt and Eric. Kurt declared a cigarette break, and then the fight resumed in the backyard. There was actual blood on the wall, says Steve. I don't want to get involved in who won the fight. All I'll say is it was a very bloody and terrible battle. Kurt beat a hasty exit after it was all over. The next day, he paid Steve Schillinger $10 to put his stuff into garbage bags and take it to Dale Crover's house. Kurt stayed at Buzz Osborne's house for a few days, then briefly moved back in with Wendy. Mr. Schillinger asked Kurt to come back, but he refused and went back to the bridge near Wendy's home, where every once in a while he'd catch fish and eat them until one day someone told him they were poisonous. Other times, he slept in the apartment above Chris' mom's beauty parlor. He'd have to wake up by 7 in the morning so he could get out of there before she came to work. In the fall of 1986, Kurt got Wendy to put down money on 1,500 East 2nd Street in Aberdeen, a decrepit little shack a few hundred yards from her house. It rented for only $100 a month, perhaps because the porch was falling off of the front of the house. It was the bottom of houses, Kurt recalls, but at least it was mine. It had 2 small bedrooms and 2 small living rooms. His housemate was Melvin's bassist Matt Lucan, who was also a trained carpenter. Lucan had to do a lot of work on the house before it was even livable. As usual, hygiene was not a priority. If you drank a beer, you could just throw the can on the floor. And with all the partying going on at the shack, the floor was covered with festive detritus. Apparently that's what they called their trash pile. They didn't have a fridge, so they kept all the food in an unplugged old ice box out on the back porch. They cooked in a toaster oven. Wendy stopped by occasionally with care packages of food. One day, Kurt bought about half a dozen turtles and put them in a bathtub in the middle of the living room. A terrarium attached to the tub took up most of the rest of the room. For irrigation, Carpenter Lucan drilled a hole in the floor and drained the smelly hamburger meat and turtle poop-fouled water into the floor underneath the home. But the foundation was so rotten that water would rise up into the floorboards. It was needless to say, a very smelly, very odorous place, says Kurt. Kurt felt a special attraction to turtles. There's a fascination with them I really can't describe, he says. Turtles basically have this fuck you attitude. I'm stuck in the tank, I'm miserable, I hate you, and I'm not going to perform for you. Then there are those protective shells. Actually, those shells really aren't that helpful, Kurt says. It's part of their spine, and it's real sensitive. If you knock on the shell, it hurts them, so it really isn't the protective covering that everyone thinks it is. If they fall on their back, it'll split open and they'll die. It's like having your spine on your outside. Kurt got a job at the Polynesian Hotel in Ocean Shores, a coastal resort about 20 miles from Aberdeen, as a janitor, fireplace cleaner, and maintenance butt boy. Once again, he didn't exactly strive to be an ideal worker. Instead of cleaning or fixing things in the hotel rooms, he'd just walk into an unoccupied room, turn on the TV, and take a nap. Kurt was always on the lookout for a cheap new high. Back then, none of us had any money, so you don't want to spend a bunch of money on coke and stuff, recalls Lucan. There was a lot of people who got into cough syrup to get high. I remember this guy I went to high school with who ate handfuls of aspirin and got high off of that. No, you cannot get high off handfuls of aspirin. That is very dangerous. If you get cut, you will bleed and bleed and bleed. Please, children, don't try it. And cough syrup no longer has codeine in it unless it's prescribed from a doctor, so don't drink a bunch of cough syrup either. At the time, a lot of kids in Aberdeen were doing acid, not to mention the powerful local marijuana inexplicably nicknamed Affy-Bud. Lucan, Jesse Reed, Kurt, and a few other stoners were sitting around one night bemoaning the fact that they were tired of all the usual highs. Then Reed remembered all those cans of shaving cream that Kurt had hung on to ever since they shared an apartment together. The shaving cream came with a little rubber stopper on the bottom of the can where the propellant was pumped in. Inhaling the propellant produced a buzz not unlike that of nitrous oxide. The manufacturers of the shaving cream have since altered the stopper on the can to discourage such abuse. The problem was a lot of it would escape, so Reed showed them how to tape a toilet paper roll onto the bottom, poke a hole in the side, and insert a screwdriver in it to pry the gasket loose. Then inhale it like a bong. They all ran down to the 7-Eleven and each bought more shaving cream. There was a brief panic when they found the gas lowered their voices, but not permanently, and the high was decent. We were all yelling at Kurt that he shouldn't have wasted all that shaving cream on decorating the doll that summer, says Lucan. We could have been getting high off of it. And then in the wee hours of one winter morning, Kurt came to Wendy's house. Mom, Kurt called up to her, his voice weak with fear. I've lost my hand. I've burnt my hand, and it's just gone. He burst into tears. Kurt had been making French fries, his staple food, and severely burned his hand on the hot grease. It was horrible, she says. It was burned clear down. It was the most sickening thing I ever saw, and I had to bandage it twice a day and peel off the... It was horrible. Kurt had already been to the hospital where a doctor had bandaged it up and told Kurt he'd never play guitar again. But then Wendy took him to a specialist she knew from working at the Grays Harbor College nursing program. Now you can't even see a scar. While he recuperated, Kurt stayed home and tried to play guitar. Without any income from work, he was forced to live on little else but rice for several months. Every once in a while, he'd splurge on a frozen Salisbury steak. I was starving to death, living in this pigsty, Kurt says, not being able to play guitar, with the threat of the landlady calling me up every day, reminding me that I owed her money. It was just a real sketchy scene. Kurt didn't know where he was going to live pretty soon. Kurt badly wanted to form a band with Chris, but Chris didn't seem interested. I kept always making it obvious that I wanted someone to play with in a band, says Kurt, but still Chris never wanted to. Kurt even lent Chris his amplifier for a week and a half to try to butter him up. But Chris didn't respond to Kurt's overtures and even made Kurt come to his house to retrieve his own amp. It sounded really nice, says Chris, but I decided to give it back to him. Kurt would slide Chris a copy of the Fecal Matter tape now and then as a not-so-subtle hint, but Chris never said a word about it. Then, a whole year after the demo had been recorded and 3 years after they first met, Chris told Kurt, I finally listened to that tape you made. It's pretty good. We should start a band. Kurt had a guitar and a PV amp. Chris used to have an amp, but he had to give it to Matt Lucan in return for bailing him out of jail after a scuffle with some rednecks in the parking lot of the Aberdeen 7-Eleven. Yes, this is true. Chris got arrested for basically defending himself. A couple rednecks attacked him. He beats the crap out of these two rednecks. Chris gets thrown in jail. Of course, the guy who wins the fight always gets thrown in jail, not the guy who starts the fight. And Chris didn't have any money to bail himself out. He didn't want to contact his parents. So he calls Matthew Lucan, who pawns his amp to get Chris out, and then Chris had to pay him back. But if you watch the Nirvana history videos, you know that Chris is working at Taco Bell at this time and does have the money to pay Lucan back. For a PA, they used another guitar amp and a cheap microphone with a diaphragm taped to it. It was a wreck, but it worked. There was an empty apartment above Mrs. Novoselich's beauty shop, and they'd play there for hours, with Chris on bass and Kurt on guitar and someone named Bob McFadden, whom Chris recalls only as some jock guy who happened to own a drum set. I do have a video, I think it's in one of the Nirvana series, that talks about Bob McFadden. There was an interview somebody did with Bob McFadden, and I go over it in that video. I'm sorry, I don't know which one it is, but yes, Bob was the very first drummer, apparently to Kristen Kurt as just some jock guy. Unfortunately, the place soon became a hangout just like the Melvins practice space, and Chris eventually had to post a sign which read, "This is not a big crash pad, so just get out of here because we want to rehearse." The underground scene was so small in Aberdeen that even Cure fans with their trendy quiffs and goth clothes would hang around the practice space. Chris and Shelley called them the Haircut 100 Club. We weren't tight with them because they were more concerned with the fashion aspect of it, says Shelley. We were just concerned with screwing around. The band worked up a little material, but for some reason the project eventually fell apart after about a month and all three went their separate ways. Chris and Shelley went to Arizona to look for work. I believe they stayed there for about 6 months. Kurt didn't like the guys who would hang out at the shack. They tended to be underage drinkers who used the house as a place to get trashed. Lucan's work as a cabinet maker was far from steady, so more often than not, he and his drinking buddies would be up until all hours, while Kurt had to get up to go to work at the resort, the Polynesian Hotel. After 5 months, Lucan realized he should move out. Dylan Carlson mentioned that he was unemployed, so Kurt told him about these great jobs they could get laying carpet in a hotel out at Ocean Shores. Carlson was going to take Lucan's room at the shack, but he stayed only 2 weeks because the carpet laying job never panned out. They went out to Ocean Shores early one morning to find that the boss was so drunk that he couldn't get off the floor to unlock the door. When they went out there a second time, the door was unlocked, but the boss had passed out in front of it, blocking the way. Carlson gave up, but Kurt tried a third time. He got in, but the boss went out to a bar and got falling down drunk. The great carpet-laying job never materialized. Kurt had been going more and more frequently to Olympia, about 50 miles east of Aberdeen, with the Melvins. The state capital, Olympia, is the home of Evergreen State College, a haven for bohemian and misfits of all stripes and a hotbed of adventurous independent music. Kurt went there most weekends to check out bands. Olympia was a small town, but it had national indie scene connections that extended from Evergreen's Chaos radio station, Op Magazine, which has since metamorphosed into Option Magazine, fanzine publisher Bruce Pavitt, he becomes one of the partners of Sub Pop, and Calvin Johnson's K Records. Calvin Johnson was somewhat of a cult figure in Olympia. Actually, not somewhat. He was the cult figure in Olympia. The youth culture there wasn't into hard rock, but instead favored a kind of naive music, pigeonholed as love rock, made by the likes of Jad Fair and the group Beat Happening, led by Calvin Johnson. Johnson dominated the scene and inspired a legion of clones, whom Kurt calls the Calvinists. Not the Calvinist from medieval times, that's a whole other story, who talked and dressed just like him, aspiring to an innocent, childlike state. Not to be confused with Daniel Johnston, who made the Hi, How Are You cassette. If you've never checked that out, you should. It was a whole community of geeks. They were even dismissed by punk rockers. The Calvinists didn't take drugs, at least they said they didn't, and they wore their hair short. Everyone played in each other's band. Everyone slept with one another. They had their own coffee shop, their own record store, and practically speaking, Chaos had become their own radio station. They started up their own little planet, says Kurt. Sounds like a hippie commune. They also had their own record label. Along with Candace Peterson, Johnson ran K Records, a small but well-connected indie label, which also distributed like-minded foreign bands such as Young Marble Giants, Kleenex, and the Vaselines. And now you know how Kurt Cobain came to cover several Vaseline songs. Calvin Johnson had connections in England, Scotland, Ireland, all places Kurt would end up loving later in his career. Kurt didn't completely buy the K ethos. He liked to wear his hair long and he liked to take drugs, but he did like the music and its message. It opened up new doors to music that I'd never heard before, Kurt says. It made me realize that for years I hadn't looked back on my childhood. I tried to forget about it. I'd just forgotten about it. It made me look back on my childhood and have fond memories of it. It was just a nice reminder of innocence. To try to remind me to stay a child, Kurt got a tattoo of the K logo, a K inside a simple shield, on his left forearm. So Kurt wasn't exactly obsessed with K Records. He wasn't exactly into everything they were into. And he didn't get the K tattoo just to represent K Records. He liked the thought of childhood innocence. And he said he got the tattoo to remind him to remain a child on the inside. Kurt remained at the shack for another 2 months after Lucan left, owing the landlady back rent. In the meantime, Kurt started seeing a young woman named Tracy Miranda. She wasn't like any of the other girls he knew. She had a zebra-striped coat and her hair was dyed fire engine red, and she lived in Olympia. Tracy liked to party and had her share of eccentricities, but she was also a placid, nurturing soul. After a few weeks, she became Kurt's first serious girlfriend. However, Tracy and Kurt had met a year or so before, in 1985, in front of the Guerrilla Gardens, a barn-like all-ages punk club, now defunct, in the Chinatown section of Seattle. They met through their mutual friend, Buzz Osborne. You will find that if you go back through the Nirvana history, Buzz Osborne is the connector. Everybody who becomes involved in Nirvana became involved through Buzz Osborne. He was a networker and he knew everybody, and he often introduced people to other people. He would see a missing piece of the puzzle and say, you know what, I got somebody for you. I know who could fill that slot. And just, he connected everybody. So I could see why Buzz would be a little jealous of Nirvana's success when he was the one who created it all. I mean, obviously you can't give him credit for the music, but he really put everybody on the right path. He was sort of the leader of the underground scene there. She and her boyfriend were sitting in their car drinking beer and talking to Buzz and Kurt, who were also drinking beer. The meeting was cut short when Tracy noticed a couple of cops heading their way and took off in the car, leaving Kurt and Buzz behind to get busted. Tracy thought Kurt was nice, if a little young looking. He was skinny and had short hair. I was struck by how blue his eyes were, she recalls. I'd never seen eyes that blue before. After befriending Chris and Shelley, she became a Klingon and met Kurt again a year later while they hung out at Buzz Osborne's parents' house one day watching Buzz and Chris drink Mad Dog. After Kurt left, Buzz informed her that Kurt was the guy who made the really cool Kiss mural on the side of the Melvin's van, known as the Mel Van, using magic markers. Every time a pen ran out, he'd go into the ShopRite in Montesano and steal another one. I thought that was kind of cool, says Tracy. And ladies and gentlemen, here we end chapter 2 of the book Come As You Are, the story of Nirvana. The next one, chapter 3, will not be so far away. I really want to start reading this. I want to get it out there for everybody to listen to and to learn from. And as well, we will be using this book to make Nirvana history videos, which if you've watched those, they're not just me reading the book. It's kind of like me creating my own narrative, my own story, but it goes right along with the information in this book. I don't always like to just read things verbatim. I like to write it in my own dialogue. Maybe you like hearing it straight up. Maybe you like hearing it from a different perspective, my perspective. You have your choice of either one. Thank you so much for watching. The next Nirvana series will be out very soon, and you're going to want to watch the next one. I've consulted with a lot of experts. I'm going to be using their answers to plug in a lot of holes, especially if you've ever wondered about Rosemary Carroll and how she just kind of disappeared with all this valuable incriminating evidence. You're going to want to watch the next video. Thank you so much. Don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye-bye.